Residents of China are fed up with the country's approach to COVID. I'm Marco Perry. Welcome to the Perry Platform. Residents of China are fed up with the government's zero COVID approach to the pandemic. On one hand, it hasn't been super effective, and on the other, there are major drawbacks, which we'll talk about, that have ignited the protests. In a nutshell, even a single case of COVID 19 can trigger extreme, draconian measures, while much of the world, on the other hand, has found more balanced approaches to COVID. China is out here acting like it's still 2020. Now, there was a time and a place maybe for a COVID zero approach. As I said, in 2020, when we didn't know much about the virus, when we were still trying to figure out how deadly it was, while we still thought it was possible to contain the spread. That type of environment may lead one to believe that a COVID zero approach could be applicable. But now we're in 2022, with a less deadly strand of the virus, with vaccines, with a greater understanding of how we can protect ourselves, and perhaps most importantly for some people, an appreciation for the damage things like lockdowns can have on the economy and on an individual's life. Now we have The Guardian reporting that Chinese authorities have initiated the highest emergency response level of censorship, according to leaked directives, including a crackdown on VPNs and other methods of bypassing online censorship after unprecedented protests and demonstrations have been widespread across the country. These demonstrations are due to the frustration the public has felt with the zero COVID policy we just talked about. Now, the government's crackdown includes the tracking and questioning of protesters, or even something as simple as liking a protest-related piece of content on social media. But at the same time, and there is some good news here, the government has been seen easing some of the pandemic restrictions, and this is something that people call a carrot and stick approach to negotiation. So, on one hand, you are getting serious with the protesters, as many authoritarian governments do, but at the same time, you do want them to ease up a little bit too, so you're offering them some benefit. You're saying, hey, we are going to crack down on you. They believe that the protesters are acting in ways that are not favorable to the current ruling party, but we kind of hear you, so we'll give you a couple benefits here to appease you. Now, even though it's not a full-on victory, one can easily view this as a positive for the side of the population. They've shown that they actually have strength. Their combined voice can influence an authoritarian ruling party of China. That's pretty big, and it might lead to further demonstrations in the future. This is something like the birth or awakening of a democratic mindset. To wake up and realize that no, one party, or further even one person, shouldn't be calling all the shots. We deserve a voice too. In some ways, these protests have already evolved. They're not just about COVID-19 anymore. We're seeing calls and criticism of the current chairman, Xi Jinping. So just to rewind a little bit and to give you some more context, these protests were already brewing in the background, but there was an event that really pushed people over the edge, and that was a fire that killed 10 people. So, according to local officials, this deadly fire was caused by a faulty power strip that caught fire on the 15th floor of a high-rise apartment, but it took the fire department over 3 hours to put out the flames, and people burnt alive in there. So, why did it take 3 hours? Well, COVID lockdown measures hampered both the fire department's response and resident efforts to flee. The lockdowns in China are draconian. They are far more intense than what you can imagine happening in a place like Canada. Hindering your movement, not allowing you to even leave your place of residency, that's all normal. And as a result of that, life-saving efforts were not able to be delivered as efficiently as they could have been otherwise. And a situation like this, paired with things like cancelled surgeries and prolonged medical diagnoses and overall life impediments, revealed the flaw in COVID zero thinking. This is a rule that we have to follow. Okay, the rule is the cure for something cannot be worse than the ailment. How many lives have been lost due to the government response? Via things like diseases progressing rapidly due to a healthcare system that seems to be solely focused on COVID-19. How many people's conditions have been made severely worse? How many lives have been negatively impacted in ways that we aren't bothering to measure? And further, the average resident is the one who bears the consequences here, while the elite can thrive. If the chairman of China needed a medical screening, do you think he'd follow the same rules that the average resident would? No. He would get it right away. If he was the one who was trapped in this burning building, would the restrictions matter? No. But for the average resident, you're out of luck in both cases. And apparently they want you to accept that because it's for the quote-unquote greater good. Now, back to the protests. As we talked about, they have been strictly censored. Residents have been using tools like VPNs to access websites and social media networks that are banned in China, and China has taken steps to curb that. Further, managers of content on these Chinese social media networks have been issued a directive to take a quote-unquote hands-on approach and strengthen content moderation and management to rapidly identify, deal with, and report information about what the government has termed offline disturbances or harmful information. And here, I want to have a tangent conversation. This is why I'm extremely against any government having the power to tell you what harmful information is. Because, inevitably, they're going to use it to fit their agenda. The government is the one making this definition, not the people. They think them protesting against COVID-19 measures is harmful. Well, that's their opinion, and it shouldn't be law. It shouldn't be an absolute truth, but they're marketing it as if it is. Freedom of speech is very important, and freedom of expression can also be lumped in there. Any government who seeks to oppose that is doing it nefariously. There's no good reason to strip the citizenry of such a right. Now, that's not to say that freedom of speech is a perfect principle. Of course, there are downsides to it. There are going to be fools who use it in ways that are actually mean, that are actually harmful, but we do have laws to curb the furthest extreme of that. For example, threats. But when we strip that right away from people, what always ends up happening is the government becomes the sole source of truth. And if that's the case, you better really believe in them. But that's impossible, because the government is a fluid mechanism, and the people in the government are going to change over time. So why arm them with that weapon in the first place? The people should be the ones who the government is afraid of, not the people afraid of the government. And related to that point, there is actually something very powerful going on here. The power of the people is on full display in China. As we talked about, the carrot and the stick approach is something that's making people feel like their voice is being heard. The one thing an authoritarian government does fear is the populace waking up and taking action, because then they can be overthrown. What's a government without any subjects? That's why they're using that approach. They're using the stick to make people think that maybe it's not worth continuing to protest. They are giving up some room on the policy anyways. And they're giving that carrot at the same time to show that they're not super authoritarian. Maybe using it to appease you, so you're not as angry. And what they're doing here is withering away the support of the protest. Maybe there are, for example, 1 million people who are protesting right now. From that million, maybe there is 10 to 20% of them who are going to drop off because of the stick, because they're afraid of the repercussions of their actions. They're going to be quiet now. And maybe there's another 10 to 20% who are very happy about the carrot. Oh, the government's actually doing something. Okay, we can back up now. That's how you dwindle support and get the numbers more manageable from a government standpoint. If there are too many people who are rising up, it's going to be a problem. So you're going to do what you can to reduce that figure while still looking powerful. They have to use the stick. That's an authoritarian government regime tactic. But they're going to use a little bit of a carrot because they do see a problem. And the citizens have earned that carrot, to speak metaphorically. There is no way that the government would be acting this quickly and with this sense of urgency if it wasn't for the people rising up. And there you go. Now you're realizing the power that you have as a group. The power to shape the government that is supposed to govern your daily lives. I do believe it's time for change, and I support fully the citizens who are voicing that sentiment. And we should all be supporting them. They're actually putting themselves in quite a dangerous place going up against China, but they're doing it because they're seeking a better future, not only for themselves, but for future generations, and that is admirable. Now, before we end off, I want to quickly condemn Apple, the opposite of a shout-out. They are a spineless corporation, as many are these days, but they make good products, so many people give them a pass. So, AirDrop, an Apple iPhone feature, allows users to share content between Apple devices, and that's become an important tool to protesters' efforts because it circumvents authoritarian censorship regimes. It bypasses any blocks that they put up. However, Apple restricted their AirDrop earlier in November, and they did that only in iPhones sold in mainland China. Interesting. I wonder why they did that. Obviously because the government told them to. What angers me the most is these corporations are so hypocritical. In America and Canada, they always like to virtue signal, to act as if they are on the side of justice and whatever, but they only do that because in the West, they're able to do so without repercussions. But when the times actually matter, when the time for them to actually show their virtue arises, they're cowards. They cave in to the authoritarian regimes around the world and create rules that favor the government over the people. You can also see this with things like rainbow logos. They'll happily trot those out across the West, but where it actually matters, in places like in the Middle East, they'll do no such thing. These are not values the company really holds. They're just catering to audiences and doing what they can to further their bottom line. Now with that, I do wish the protesters the best of luck, and I do hope they remain safe. An authoritarian regime becomes most dangerous when they're boxed into a corner, because the power is something they don't want to lose. And when that becomes a real possibility, they're going to do whatever they can to hold on to it. And usually that results in bloody situations, and I do hope that's not the case here. We do need a maturing government in China, not only for the Chinese residents, but for the world at large. They're a major economic player, and for them to evolve that government into one that's more modernized will be great for everyone. And with that, it does bring us to the end of our conversation for today. If you enjoyed the material, be sure to leave a review and share. That'll help us grow. And you can find me online at perryplatform.org and on social media at perryplatform. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.